Good morning, Bookers, and welcome back to another episode of Bucks Books. I have this problem where if I really like a book, I'll let it percolate. Like, I'll sit on it for a while so I can really think about everything that happened in it, so I can do the processing, so then I can bring a more complete perspective on it to you, the beloved viewer. The problem is, I'll just keep waiting because I'll think that I have more to process, and then I'll forget bits of it. And then by the time I actually sit down and do the thing, there's not as much of the thing left to do, and it's immensely frustrating. So I'm going to try to streamline this process by forcing myself to do these books faster. You know, it's going to be part of the process. I'm going to finish a book, and I'm going to do the review of the book, and then I'm going to move on with my life. And that way I'm not going to keep hitting these bottlenecks. Unfortunately, this is one of the books where I hit a bottleneck, and it sucks because it was so good. It's so good, dude. It's called Trauma and the Soul, a Psycho-Spiritual Approach to Human Development and its Interruption by Kalsched. My man Donnie is a depth psychologist, right? And I like depth psychology a lot because these Jungians, they're cultured, right? They draw from all of these different domains in order to put together a more comprehensive and cohesive picture of what might be going on in the unconscious, which we don't know. By virtue of it being the unconscious, we don't know what's going on in the unconscious, but it does hold the answer to everything that's going on in the conscious, right? So, you go, it's like Willie Sutton said, you go where the money is. You know? We need to figure out what's hidden down there. We need to get down and just bilge pump the depths in order to understand what parts need to be integrated, what parts need to be healed, what wounds we're not acknowledging. That's like the premise of psychology as a concept. Old school psychology, obviously, of the witchy kind. New school psychology is CBT, and we like it because you can bill for it very readily. Talked about coping skills for 15 minutes. Okay, make sure you write down your mood board. So, like, once upon a time, there was some elegance to psychology. There was poetry to it, right? And I'm a big believer in the necessity of that mythical quality because of the way our brains work, the storytelling animal. You know, we understand things episodically, which is why all these mnemonic cheaters in their little mind palaces, they use narratives in order to remember long strings of numbers or whatever, pi to 1,000 digits. Now, the only way that would be possible is if you could encode it using your episodic memory. Episodic memory works because that's how our brains were built to function. It's how we were built to function. That said, the things that happen in depth psychology and the Jungian approach are the things that happen most innately to the brain, in my ever humble opinion. Obviously, there's no proving it because this is all just shadows and smoke. You know, we're just guessing. You can't prove it in a lab. You can't test it. You know, there's no way to make this double blind. It works for some people, it doesn't work for others, but the same is true of CBT. However, CBT works for some people on a short time frame, which is what we're concerned with because that's what the insurance companies pay for. But not that I'm bitter. Depth psychology is about that. It's about plumbing those depths. It's about exploration of the seafloor. You know, finding out your actual psychological geography. And that's what Kalsched is attempting to do with Trauma and the Soul. And more to the point, he's trying to connect it with the concept of spirituality. Because, once again, barring elephants in their graveyards, well, as far as we know, man is the only animal capable of spiritual belief, too. Well, that's sort of what makes him man, as compared to, I don't know, even a lot of the other primates are walking on two legs now. Well, even the chimpanzees are using tools. We're losing a lot of our claims to fame, but we still have God. And Kalsched connects it with the concept of shamanic soul retrieval, which is something I always believed kind of correlates pretty neatly when you talk about, especially when you talk about PTSD. Narrative exposure therapy, when you just tell the story to desensitize yourself to the story, that is identical to indigenous belief systems of soul retrieval, which is there was some traumatic event in the past that left your soul fragmented, right? And part of that soul, part of your soul is still trapped in that event in the past. And what the shaman does is he goes with you to that event and you describe it or picture it or whatever in as vivid detail as you possibly can, and that allows a reintegration of that soul piece into the chipped whole that you were carrying, and once that's fitted back together, you yourself are able to heal from that. That is exactly what narrative exposure therapy is. That's what PTSD therapy is. Even if you're doing another modality like EMDR, same concept. You're getting very sleepy. Look at the silly monkey. And then your eyes go back and forth. But what's happening in your head is you're revisiting that event. You are going back to that point and recapturing that broken piece and reattaching it, fastening it back on to the whole. Or ART, accelerated resolution therapy, same thing. Look at the camera. Click in the do you see, but like same deal. You're back where you were. You're picturing where you were. You're going back to that moment with this guide, even though the guide doesn't know what's going on, giving you the opportunity to collect all these pieces and bundle them back up, right? And that's what Donald is pitching in this. And he talks so widely, and I feel like I'm doing you a disservice here, honestly, because there's a lot of stuff that I would have liked to have referred to specifically, and I forgot everything I didn't write down, but I did write down one thing in particular, right? And this is a quote from the book, word for word. St. Anthony in the desert asked how he could differentiate between angels who came to him humble and devils who came in rich disguise. Said, "You could tell how you felt after they departed. When an angel left, you felt strengthened by his presence. When a devil left, you felt horror. Grief is a humble angel who leaves you with strong, clear thoughts and a sense of your own depth. Depression is a demon who leaves you appalled." And that sat me right down. That's a good line. That's good writing. And it's true. Grief is hard. Grief is probably one of the hardest things you're ever going to do. If you're lucky, grief is one of the hardest things you'll ever do. It hits you so profoundly and powerfully that it's sent crumbling to the floor, completely incapable of functioning. And as when the angels appeared, be not afraid. I got no choice, dude. I'm reacting to this right now. But grief is there for a reason. And once you learn the lessons it's teaching you, once you integrate that grief, you can move on from it. You're stronger for it on the other side. It's not a strength that you wanted. It's a strength you would have opted out of if you could have. But that's how most strength is built. It only happens when we're tested. And sometimes the tests suck big time. But out the other side, you are stronger, you are more stable, you are more worldly. You have a greater understanding of not only how the universe works, but how you yourself works. And though there might be that missing piece, from whatever you lost, whoever you lost, you're soldiering on and honoring their memory. That's grief. Depression biochemically feels like grief, but there's no point of resolution. You don't get better because there's no better to get. Nothing happened. Depression is the demon that leaves you appalled. It's a trick. you know, and in the same way you can have that grief and still understand it as grief, and you can beat yourself up for it if you want. A lot of people do that. Oh, I should be over it by now. Grief doesn't work on your timeline. In the same way that you don't get to tell that avenging angel, that guy who's visiting you, to pass this lesson on, this information on. You don't get to tell, well, tell God I think that's enough. I got a schedule. All right, buddy? Well, that's not really how that works. You can do that with depression. Because depression is a demon. Demons are just made of lies. You can compel them with the power of Christ, you know? And that's a figurative power of Christ unless you are deeply Christian, in which case it's a literal power of Christ. I'm sure Christ wouldn't mind. But like, you can still dispel them yourself. You cannot dispel the angel of grief. You can try to ignore it for a while, but it will make itself known. You can dispel the demon depression because it is a little punk ass. It listens to you. You're in charge of that. It doesn't feel that way. And the more you tell it that it's in charge, the more it's going to agree with you, because that's all a demon like depression wants. It wants to be worshipped. And that's what you do when you let it call your shots. That's what you do when you let it run your life. That's what you do when you don't go for your mental health walk, when you don't do your journaling, when you don't get your sunlight exposure, when you don't take your shower, when you don't force yourself to get out of bed because, oh, I don't have the motivation. You're worshiping that demon. You're giving it. You're giving over the control. And it's never going to go away because it's not built to go away. I thought that was a fantastic analogy from Donald Kalsched. That really moved me. I've been thinking about it in those terms since, but I try not to apply it in session because it's spiritually presumptuous. The whole book is about stuff like that, though. The whole book is about spirituality. It digs into the Divine Comedy and draws a lot of parallels between the recovering from trauma and the phases of hell, essentially. Dante's journey with Virgil draws a lot of parallels between, of course, other fairy tales, because he's a depth psychologist. You know, they love fairy tales. They love archetypes. They're all going to be tied up in myths and folklore and legends, which, once again, I'm all about. I would highly recommend this book if you are in psychology, in any facet, or social work, you know, and deal with trauma. If let's do two different things, all right? If you are in psychology in any capacity, right? If you deal with trauma in a non-psychology capacity, or have trauma of your own that you're trying to deal with, or if you're smart, any of those three things, this book is a must-read, okay? This is necessary for your development. Cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a spectacular book. I'm probably going to read it again. I have like 60 books on my to-read list right now, so I'm going to have to double back around to it. But I'm putting this on the camera right now so I remember moving forward that I'm probably going to read this again. All right, that's long enough. Like, follow, subscribe, etc. See you soon.